It was a great movie, but
Yeah.
it seemed like there was resistance to that movie. I thought was very strange. There was like Hollywood resistance to that movie. Like people didn't like that you were making it.
No.
Mel Gibson sat down with Joe Rogan and revealed 3 hidden details buried inside the Passion of the Christ that nobody was ever supposed to notice. A face in the crucifixion scene most viewers never looked twice at, a pair of dead women whose private visions built the film scene by scene, and a single line of Aramaic dialogue he refused to cut, even after his own brother begged him to remove it. Rogan sat there stunned. His research team scrambled for articles mid-sentence, and by the end, Rogan could not believe what Gibson had just said out loud on the record.
The story
Hollywood buried.
You're in another place. You're in another realm. You need to go to hell. You need to go to Sheol.
On January 9th, 2025, Mel Gibson walked into the studio for episode 2254 of the Joe Rogan Experience. By the time he walked out, the conversation had already become one of the most talked about podcast episodes of the entire year. To understand what Gibson finally said out loud that afternoon, you have to go back to the moment The Passion of the Christ almost died before a single frame was shot. In 1996, Mel Gibson stood at the highest point of his career. Braveheart had just won Best Picture and Best Director at the Academy Awards. He could have walked into any studio in Hollywood and green-lit almost any project he wanted. A war movie, a sequel, a franchise, any of it. Instead, he walked in with a script about the last 12 hours of the life of Jesus Christ, written entirely in reconstructed Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew. No major English-speaking stars, no conventional action sequences, no subtitle-free marketing path, and a subject matter so divisive that studios did not even want to be publicly associated with it. 7 major studios refused it. 20th Century Fox, which had a first-look deal with Gibson's own company, issued a public statement saying it would absolutely not be involved. Columbia passed, MGM passed, Paramount passed, Universal passed, Disney passed, Warner Brothers passed. Gibson told Rogan what he encountered was not just commercial caution, it was something far more pointed. He told Rogan directly that in Hollywood, Christianity is the one religion you are still allowed to disparage. The same community that championed other faiths on screen had a categorically different and hostile response to this particular story. Rogan did not push back. He just nodded and agreed. Gibson refused to fold. He had financed Braveheart himself. He knew exactly how to make a movie without institutional permission. So, he wrote a check for $30 million to cover production, then a second check for $15 million to cover marketing and distribution, $45 million of his own money. No studio input, no creative interference, no safety net at all. He hired Professor William Fulco of Loyola Marymount University to translate the script into Aramaic and Latin. Fulco deliberately built in occasional pronunciation irregularities because the characters in the story would not have spoken those languages as their native tongue. Every single creative decision was made without a single executive having any say whatsoever. Then Gibson told Rogan something that most interviewers had never gotten him to say this clearly. The film, he said, was never about Jewish leaders or Roman soldiers. It was about personal responsibility. Every viewer, every century, every person watching. And that sets up the first hidden detail. Hidden detail number 1, the hands on the hammer.
A thing that comes into it from having read the book a few times. You read the book a few times and it's just like the resurrection of the Christ.
Watch the crucifixion scene again. Watch the moment the hammer comes down. Watch the hands that drive the iron nails through the flesh. Watch them carefully. Those are not an actor's hands. Those are not a stand-in's hands. Those are Mel Gibson's hands. He put himself in the frame. He made himself the executioner on purpose. In the single most important scene of the entire film, the director of the movie is the one holding the hammer, and he never once pointed it out in the press tour. He never wrote about it. He never asked anyone to notice. He told Rogan why. The film was never about blaming someone. It was conceived as a film about personal responsibility. He told Rogan, in his own words, that the entire point was that we are all responsible for this, not a specific group from a specific century, every single person watching. So when it came time to film the hands driving the nails, Gibson walked into frame and did it himself. He made himself the executioner on purpose. That is hidden detail number 1, the dark place that made the film possible. Most people assumed Gibson made this film from a place of deep faith and rock-solid certainty. That is not what he told Rogan. He told Rogan that in the years before production, he had spent a long time trapped in what he called his animal brain, a constant state of fight or flight. He could not sleep, he could not function. He went to a brain specialist named Dr. Daniel Amen, who injected a radioactive tracer into his bloodstream to photograph his brain activity. When Dr. Amen opened the results file while Gibson was in the room, he looked up from the images and quietly asked Gibson if he was all right. The film was not born from certainty. It was born from a man in genuine crisis who turned back to the story that had shaped him as a child and decided to tell it with everything he had left. Gibson's Catholicism is not the mainstream institutional version most American Catholics know. He is a traditionalist who rejects the reforms of the Second Vatican Council of the 1960s. He built a private chapel in Malibu called the Church of the Holy Family, where the traditional Latin Mass is observed exclusively. His father, Hutton Gibson, was a publicly known Catholic traditionalist whose views on the council were controversial in their own right. That theological background shaped every single frame of the film. The language choices, the visual sources, and above all, the refusal to soften any part of the story to accommodate a modern audience that might find it uncomfortable. Gibson told Rogan, in his own words, that the beauty of the faith is that even for your worst transgression, you can be forgiven and redeemed. He said he truly believes God sent his son to ransom humanity from its fallen nature and to provide a blueprint for how to live. He also acknowledged, without hesitation, that he was by nature an alcoholic, that the years when he drifted from his faith were years when everything in his life moved in the wrong direction, and that the film was his desperate attempt to transmit through cinema what he could not transmit through language. You could always tune out a sermon. You could not tune out what he put on that screen. If you are still watching this far in, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. The next chapter is where the second hidden detail comes out, and it is the one nobody in mainstream coverage of the film ever talked about. Hidden detail number 2, the 2 dead women nobody talks about.
It was a great movie, but it seemed like there was resistance to that movie.
Especially with something like The Passion that I did, the written word was very important because it was, you got all those books, the Bible, you've got the different Gospels and stuff that people are quite familiar with. Half the time, they didn't even need to read the subtitles. They could look at it and know what was going on.
For 20 years, critics argued about the violence in the Passion of the Christ, the extended 2-part scourging scene, the specific design of the crown of thorns, pressed down so hard the thorns punctured the skull, the exact number of falls on the Via Dolorosa, the way individual characters respond in specific moments, the way the devil appears in the garden, the way Mary runs toward her son when he falls. Every critic who wrote about this film assumed Gibson pulled all of it directly from the 4 Gospels of the New Testament. He did not. He drew it from a 19th century German mystic named Anne Catherine Emmerich, a stigmatist, a woman who spent the last 12 years of her life bedridden and never left her village. She dictated 50 chapters of detailed sensory description of the Passion to the German poet Clemens Brentano. She claimed the scenes came to her in mystical visions. She described streets in Jerusalem she had never seen with her own eyes. She described the exact weight of the cross, the exact pattern of the crown, the exact words exchanged between the characters on the road to Calvary. Gibson read her book, and then he put her visions on screen. He also drew on the visions of Maria of Agreda, a 17th century Spanish mystic whose writings filled 4 volumes. A woman who claimed to have visited the New World while her body remained in a Spanish convent. Another Catholic mystic whose revelations the Vatican has never formally endorsed. Gibson has confirmed this in multiple interviews across 2 decades. The film that critics accused of being anti-Semitic was actually built scene by scene on the private revelations of 2 dead Catholic women. The blueprint for the most scrutinized religious film of the 21st century was not drawn from canonical scripture. It was drawn from the mystical visions of two women whose accounts the church itself has never officially recognized. That is what was buried inside the Passion of the Christ. That is hidden detail number 2. Hidden detail number 3. The line Gibson refused to cut. The pre-release controversy that nearly buried the Passion of the Christ before opening night came down to a single line of Aramaic dialogue. The line is from Matthew 27, "His blood be upon our children and upon us." In the script, Gibson had it. In the rough cut, Gibson had it. When the controversy started, religious leaders demanded it be removed entirely. Distributors told him to cut it. His own brother told him to cut it. Gibson told one interviewer that if he included it in the English subtitles, people would come kill him. So, he made a decision that almost nobody noticed at the time. He cut the subtitle, he did not cut the line. The Aramaic audio of that exact line from Matthew 27 remains in the theatrical release print of The Passion of the Christ to this day. Scholars have confirmed publicly that the words are still there in the spoken audio. Only the English translation was removed. The line is audible to anyone who understands Aramaic. It is silent to everyone else. Gibson has never fully explained why he made that choice. He told his brother he had initially planned to remove it completely. Then he kept it in, not visible, not translated, but present, embedded in the film where nobody could see it unless they knew exactly what to listen for. That is hidden detail number 3, the shroud, the apostles, and the argument that silenced Rogan. This was the exchange that landed hardest on the Rogan episode. It was not about filmmaking, it was about evidence. Gibson told Rogan he believes the Gospels are verifiable history, not mythology, and he came prepared to make the case. He pointed to Tacitus, the Roman historian who confirmed the execution of Jesus under Pontius Pilate. He pointed to Josephus, the Jewish historian whose references to Jesus have been confirmed as authentic by scholars across multiple disciplines. Then he pointed to the apostles, and he made the argument slowly, deliberately. Every one of those men except John chose death rather than deny what they claimed to have witnessed. People lie to save themselves. Nobody dies for something they know is not true. Rogan did not answer. He did not counter. He just sat with it. Then Gibson brought up the Shroud of Turin, the 14th century linen cloth preserved in Turin that bears the image of a crucified man. Burn marks from a 1532 fire, blood stains consistent with flagellation wounds, and the faint, unexplained image of a face that no scientist has ever fully reproduced. He told Rogan that an archaeologist he knew personally, the same man who had translated the Passion script into Aramaic, had found marks on the shroud consistent with a Tiberius coin having been placed over the eyes, a documented 1st century Jewish burial practice. The coin, if confirmed, would provide a historical dating mechanism, placing the cloth in the 1st century. Not the Middle Ages, not a medieval forgery, the 1st century. Rogan's research team scrambled. Within seconds, they pulled up 2 articles published within the preceding 6 months, reaching opposite conclusions about the shroud's age. Rogan read them out, and Gibson used them directly. The question is not settled. The 1988 carbon dating that dismissed the shroud as medieval has been complicated by subsequent analysis, showing the tested fibers came from a later repair patch, not from the original cloth. Gibson is not presenting the shroud as proof. He is presenting it as one specific, verifiable data point in a larger argument that the historical claims of Christianity have not been debunked, only ignored. That distinction matters on a podcast where Rogan has spent years pressing people on exactly that kind of intellectual sleight of hand. Gibson made the argument without hedging. He did not say he hoped it was true. He said he had looked at the evidence and found it compelling. Rogan did not push back. Rogan did not interrupt. He just nodded, looked down, and let Gibson finish. For a man who had been called a religious fanatic by mainstream critics for over 2 decades, the precision with which he made that case in a non-religious context was the moment the conversation stopped being about a movie, what Jim Caviezel actually endured. When Gibson called Jim Caviezel to offer him the role, Caviezel pointed out that his initials were JC and that he was 33 years old. Gibson told him he was freaking him out and hung up the phone. Before Caviezel accepted, Gibson warned him directly, "You will never work in this town again." Caviezel accepted anyway. What followed was the most physically punishing performance in the history of American cinema, not measured in awards, measured in what it cost the man who delivered it. He dislocated his left shoulder carrying the cross, which weighed over 150 pounds. He was accidentally struck twice by a real whip during the scourging scene, when the actor behind him missed the concealed post. The second blow left a 14-inch scar across his back that he still carries today. He spent months nearly naked in the Italian winter, temperatures at 25 degrees Fahrenheit, winds at 30 knots. He developed hypothermia, a lung infection, and pneumonia. The prosthetic covering one eye to simulate swelling destroyed his depth perception and gave him migraines for the duration of the shoot. He lost 45 pounds, and then came the lightning. On the very last shot of the entire film, Caviezel was struck. He described the 4 seconds before impact as a sudden, eerie silence, the kind of silence that does not happen in nature. Then he said it was like both ears being slapped at once. He saw pink static. People around him began screaming. Producer Steve McEvedy reported seeing smoke coming from Caviezel's ears. Assistant director Jan Michelini was struck seconds later, standing a few feet away. It was the second time Michelini had been struck on that same production. In 2023, Caviezel publicly confirmed something he had not said before. Following the lightning strike, he died briefly at the hospital and was revived. The filming also required 2 heart surgeries, including open heart surgery. He spoke about it quietly, without drama, as though it were simply something that had happened to him, and he was still trying to make sense of it 20 years later. Gibson's warning turned out to be accurate. Caviezel found himself unable to get major roles in Hollywood. He was blacklisted, his agents dropped him, his lawyer dropped him over a subsequent faith-based project. The man who carried the film that made more money than almost any independent production in history was effectively pushed out of the industry that had refused to finance it and then watched it become a phenomenon. The conversions and the healings on the set. The Italian actor cast as Judas Iscariot walked onto that set as a self-described angry atheist. Luca Lionello walked off a Catholic. He made his first confession. He had his marriage sanctified in the church. He baptized his children. He has spoken about it publicly in multiple interviews in the years since. A Muslim crew member who played one of the guards in the beating sequences also converted before filming concluded, a detail Caviezel himself confirmed. Father John Bartunek, the theological consultant on set, described a production where everyone felt openly comfortable discussing faith in ways that simply do not happen on film sets. Maya Morgenstern, the Romanian Jewish actress who played Mary, was secretly pregnant during filming. She did not tell the production, a pregnant Jewish woman playing a Jewish mother watching her son die, surrounded by a story about life coming out of death. It was a symmetry the crew only fully absorbed after it became known. Gibson also told Rogan about a young girl with severe epilepsy who was present during filming and went an entire month without a single seizure. Other reports of restored senses reached the production. Gibson did not present any of this as proof of miracles. He presented it as a pattern that those present could not account for through ordinary means, and he said all of it on the record. Rogan did not interrupt him once. $612 million against Hollywood. The Passion of the Christ opened on Ash, Wednesday, February 25, 2004. The New York Times had already predicted the film would end Gibson's career. On opening day, the film earned $26 million. Nearly the entire production budget recovered in a single 24-hour window. By the end of the first week, it had crossed $125 million. By the end of the first month, it was past $200 million. The New York Times subsequently published a piece and acknowledging that the film had revealed to the industry an audience whose existence had not been known. The final worldwide gross was $612 million against a $30 million production budget. Gibson's distribution deal with Newmarket Films split gross profits 50-50. His share of the box office alone came to approximately $150 million. DVD and home video added another $75 million, when licensing, merchandise, and ongoing streaming revenue were included. Gibson's personal earnings from a film that every single studio had refused have been estimated at between $400 and $475 million. It is the largest individual payday from a single film in the history of Hollywood. Roger Ebert gave it 4 stars. He wrote that he had never understood the depth of the suffering in the gospel accounts until he watched this film. He called it the most violent and intense film he had ever seen. He said that not as a criticism, but as a measure of what Gibson had accomplished. The studios that had passed on it did not commission more films like it. They quietly developed lower-budget religious content designed to capture some of the audience Gibson had exposed without the conviction or the risk. None of those projects came close. The pre-release controversy, orchestrated largely through early distribution of a leaked script to religious leaders who had not yet seen the finished film, had been designed to kill the project before it opened. It failed. Gibson told Rogan that the violence was not there to shock. It was there to make the theological claim impossible to intellectualize. Christianity does not make the claim of redemption in abstract terms. It makes it in the specific physical language of suffering. Any portrayal that softened that suffering was, in Gibson's view, dishonest to what the story actually says. He made the film for an era that had become immune to comfortable religious imagery. The only register that could not be looked away from was the one he chose. The house burning while he spoke, Mel Gibson on Fox News prime time after losing his home in the California fires. And then, in events like this, you sort of look, well, is it on purpose? Which is an insane thing to think. While Gibson sat in the Joe Rogan studio on January 9, 2025, his house in Pacific Palisades was on fire. The Los Angeles wildfires had reached his neighborhood. His girlfriend and young son had evacuated safely. Gibson found out during the session. He kept talking. He did not react on camera. Rogan's team learned about the fire only after the episode had already been released. By then, the footage was public, and Gibson had gone home to nothing. He did not mention it on the podcast. He did not pause the conversation. He did not ask for a break. He finished the session. He talked about the crucifixion scene. He talked about the apostles. He talked about the shroud. He talked about the sequel. And somewhere during those 3 hours, his house in the Palisades burned to the ground. A man talking about sacrifice and what it costs to create something that matters, while his own home burned while he spoke. That was not staged. That was not planned. That was not built into the episode for dramatic effect. That was just what happened. The sequel Gibson called an acid trip. Gibson has titled the sequel The Resurrection of the Christ. He told Rogan the script is finished and that writing it with his brother and Randall Wallace, the screenwriter behind Braveheart, took over 7 years. When Rogan asked him to describe it, Gibson used 2 words, an acid trip. He said he had never encountered anything quite like it in his career. Not in Braveheart, not in Apocalypto, not in anything he had directed, produced, or watched another filmmaker attempt. Then he used the word ambitious in a way that made it sound less like promotional language and more like a genuine warning. He was not certain he could pull it off. That admission, from a man who had already done the commercially impossible once, was the thing that stopped Rogan mid-sentence. The film does not open at the empty tomb. It begins with the fall of the angels, before creation, before the garden, before any human being existed. It goes to hell, to the realm Gibson described using the Hebrew term Sheol, the underworld of the dead as understood in the tradition he was drawing from. Not the modern cartoon hell of fire and pitchforks, the ancient Hebrew concept of the place where the dead wait. It spans, in his own words, from the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle. Gibson told Rogan that is the story he has been trying to tell for 2 decades, and that the first film was always just the first half of it. Lionsgate confirmed in May 2025 that it will co-produce and distribute the film in North America. Sony Pictures, under the Columbia banner, will handle international distribution rights. Jim Caviezel, the man who died briefly during the first production and now carries 2 heart surgeries on his medical record because of it, will reprise the role of Jesus. De-aging visual effects will be used to maintain continuity between the 2 films. Gibson told Rogan he was aiming to begin principal photography in 2026 and acknowledged that the technical challenge of depicting spiritual realms, cosmic warfare, and a physical resurrection without being cheap or obvious was one he had been turning over for years and had not yet fully solved. But Gibson said he is ready to take on the challenge. Because what was buried inside the Passion of the Christ was never a secret about the film itself. It was a secret about what the film was actually doing to the people who watched it. The acid trip does not exist to make money. It exists because Gibson decided more than 20 years ago that he had something to say about what this story means, and he is not finished saying it yet. So here is the question: was The Passion of the Christ actually a movie? Or was it something closer to what Gibson was hinting at on that podcast, an argument disguised as a film, delivered to an audience that Hollywood did not believe existed? Tell me in the comments what you think Gibson was really doing on that Rogan episode. And if this story pulled you in, stick around. The videos popping up on the screen right now go deeper into the things nobody in that industry wants on the record.